We continue today our exploration in the Gospel of Mark. Today, our journey continues into chapter 6, verses 32 through chapter 8, verse 21. A lot of ground to cover as we move these 11 weeks through Mark's Gospel narrative. This morning's journey with Mark begins, as so many scenes in Mark do, with a crowd hurrying on foot from all the towns toward where they believe they'll catch up with Jesus. He and the disciples were off to a wilderness place to be by themselves. But when they arrived, the chaos of the great crowd was already there. And he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. But it got late, and the disciples got concerned about what the crowd and perhaps what they were going to eat. They said to Jesus, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something to eat for themselves." But Jesus replied with what in the Greek is an emphatic command. "You give them something to eat." The disciples knew that food for this many people would cost 7 or 8 months' wages, and they protested the command that they should be the ones to take responsibility for the hunger of the crowd, suggesting that they just be sent away to the nearby villages to scrounge up some food for themselves. But Jesus replies, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus ordered the disciples to seat the crowd of people who had followed them out to this isolated place, who had listened to Jesus teaching all day long. The literal language used here is suggestive of the disciples seating the people, not just having them sit down, seating them as in a banquet or a festive party. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. He took, gave thanks, broke, and gave it to them. These are the precise words used in Mark's Last Supper scene just a few chapters away. Don't miss the significance of just how many scenes of the messianic banquet exist in the text of Scripture beyond just the one that we are accustomed to ritually reenacting in communion. In fact, this story alone is found more than any other story in all 4 Gospels, a total of 6 times. It's an archetypal story, speaking beyond its historicity to a meaning that transcends the facts of the narrative itself, to say something of mythic proportions. And all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. This is a story not just of an adequate feeding, but of the experience of radical plenty, the abundance of creation experienced in the sharing of this meal. The story looks backward, as its original hearers in Mark's church would have recognized that Israel, wandering in the wilderness, hungry and in need of divine provision. The story looks forward, as Mark's hearers would have surely heard, to the Last Supper that Jesus shares with his disciples, and which Mark's early church and ours reenacts in the Eucharistic celebration of communion. And the story portrays the extravagance of the messianic banquet at the end of the age. And then a narrative element ruined for those of us who have heard this tale so many times before. Mark reveals the true nature of the extravagance in this scene as a surprise detail at the very end of the story. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. And with that, immediately, Jesus puts the disciples in a boat and had them go on ahead of him across the sea to Bethsaida, while he sent the crowds on their way. And after saying goodbye, Jesus went up on the mountain to pray. I hope by now you're hearing the landscape speak. Jesus leaves the chaos of the crowds that followed him to the wilderness place, and he ascends the spatial location of divine revelation, the mountain, to pray. Mark is emphasizing for us here Jesus's humanity, his need to pray, even while Mark is preparing to reveal to us again the revelation of his divinity. When evening came, the boat was out on the lake, and he was alone on the land. When he, Jesus, saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. And he intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And then they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. The sea speaks up again in Mark's narrative as the mythic symbol of chaos and the liminal space of crossing between people and place from Jewish territory to a Gentile city. The sea is so chaotic that the disciples can't cross it, even with a boat. Jesus, on the other hand, didn't even need a boat. Jesus experiences the chaos of the sea as if it were the ordered space of land. And if you're hearing this with ears attuned to the references Mark is subtly making to stories of the Hebrew Bible, you'll notice a few allusions here, like how passing by was a part of so many theophany stories of the Hebrew Bible in which God appears to the human. Without that knowledge, it may seem a little odd that Jesus intended to pass them by. But for Jesus, this was a moment of epiphany. But his intentions of revealing something to the disciples are frustrated by the disciples' fear and lack of recognition, as they thought he was a ghost. And then the words Jesus chooses to calm their fear. It is I, or a more literal translation, I am. The very words used with Moses at the burning bush in Exodus. Do not be afraid. Words so typical of the divine address throughout the latter part of Isaiah. And you would think that after all of this, the disciples would finally respond in faith. But their hearts were hardened and they did not understand. As Eugene says of Mark's narrative, perception and understanding is more than believing that the miracle happened. To understand is to receive a divine gift. For the pagans, miracles were about the miracle itself and what it said about the divine man performing them. For Mark, understanding miracles was rooted in Jewish apocalypticism, in which the miracle was to be understood as a manifestation, an anticipation of the reigning presence of God on the horizon. And the disciples did not understand. So in an odd geographic turn, Jesus and the disciples end up back on the same side of the sea from which they departed. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might even touch the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Then Jesus has another clash with the Pharisees and scribes, the authoritative interpreters of the scripture and tradition over purity laws. And Mark, who is structuring this narrative in a way that will speak to questions that his mostly Gentile congregation is asking, works his way through this story to present Jesus as the ultimate revelation of God's will, making the very bold assertion that Jesus has declared all foods clean. But far from getting them off the hook in attending to concerns of purity and defilement, Mark presents a universalizing view of defilement, such that it is what comes out of the person, from within, from the heart, that makes one unclean, not what goes in the mouth. Then, portraying Jesus' movement outward toward the Gentiles of the world in a way that speaks to his own congregation's social location, Mark's narrative moves to the region of Tyre, a Gentile city that was a stereotypical oppressor of God's people, a place in the mind of the hearers was destined for divine retribution. So if you're looking for a place to represent those who are really, really outsiders to the realm of God, Tyre is it. And to Tyre they go. And here, one of the most uncomfortable portrayals of Jesus in all of the Gospels takes place. Immediately, a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, came and fell at his feet. The woman was Greek, Syro-Phoenician by nationality, and she was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he was saying to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Let me be clear about what's happening here, because there are socio-political overtones that we completely miss if we don't understand the context. They are in Tyre, the quintessential enemy, outsider, adversarial territory of the Gentiles. The woman is Greek, and based on the words she uses to describe the bed and the table in her home, she is...
Yes. Yeah, well, hold on just for a second. I had this.
Boring says, the poor farmers of Galilee saw the products of their labor become bread on the tables of wealthy Tyrians. Bread was thus a potent economic symbol, as well as having deep theological overtones. And there's more at stake for those who are hearing the story in Mark's congregation. Remember, mostly Gentiles. The word used for the children being fed is not a typical word for feeding or eating. It's literally translated something like this. Jesus says, first, let the children be satisfied, filled up, eat to the full, which combined with the rich theological imagery of bread is indicative that he's talking about something much larger than a meal here. He's saying something about eschatological salvation. Who is in and who is out on an ultimate scale. And she and her daughter and the people they represent, people closest to Mark's congregation, are outsiders. Not the children, but the dogs. And Jesus makes his disdain for her clear in the words he uses. And we shouldn't think he is simply making a show to get to a greater point. His words are harsh, describing her and her daughter as dogs, which in the Jewish imagination are outsiders, scavengers, not cute puppies sitting under the table. What he said to this woman about her child is insulting in the extreme, and it plays on all of the prejudices of his people toward the Gentile region of Tyre. And don't miss the fact that he is refusing to heal her daughter of a debilitating life-consuming, death-dealing possession. But the woman responded to Jesus, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." She's the only person in all of Mark to address Jesus with the word Lord. And while acknowledging him as Lord, she challenges him and his entire way of seeing God's salvific activity in the world. And he said to her, "Because of this saying, go, the demon has come out of your daughter." And she went away to her house and found the child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. The exorcism occurs off stage because it isn't exactly the point of the story. Something of much larger significance has shifted here. And they leave Tyre, remaining in the Gentile territory, and something strange takes place. So strange that Matthew and Luke, who draw on Mark's narrative to compose their own stories, completely leave out this part of it altogether. It has echoes of the Hellenistic stories of magic and the workings of traveling miracle workers. Only in this story, it's Jesus using all of those tropes. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up toward heaven, he sighed and said, "Be opened." And immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Taking the person aside from the crowd so that they couldn't see the magical formula being worked out, touching of fingers, using saliva, sighing, pronouncing magic words, were all part of the Hellenistic divine man stories. But here Jesus does the miracle, and the whole crowd was astounded beyond measure and said, "He has done everything well." 3 specific echoes in that statement from the concluding words of the creation story in Genesis 1. And the original hearers, hearing this story set within the context of the Hebrew Bible, get the overtones of the new creation that is coming about in Jesus. Then, still in Gentile territory, we come to another story that parallels the one we started with. The first was a miraculous feeding of a large Jewish audience. Now, it's a Gentile feeding story, again, in the wilderness, that place of testing, and where any nourishment to be found must come from the hand of God, as it had in the Exodus story. This time it's Jesus who is concerned for what the crowd is going to eat, not the disciples. But they protest his concern. How can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? Do you hear the story of Exodus coming through in that question? He asks them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Literally, in the Greek, the image here is one that is used for reclining at a formal meal, a banquet, not an outdoor picnic. So he orders the crowd to recline as at a banquet table on the earth. And he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute. Hear those words again. And they distribute them to the whole crowd. And they had also a few small fish. And after blessing them, he ordered these too should be distributed. They ate and were filled. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. At this point, I probably don't need to even tell you because you're getting it by now. But this is not a story of a miracle of feeding a large crowd. There are overtones all through this story that indicate to those hearing this narrative in Mark's congregation that this is a foreshadowing of the Eucharistic meal that will come later in Mark's story, and that is celebrated among their own worship gatherings. And this story of eschatological abundance, so much food that they filled 7 baskets, is one shared with Gentiles like them. Then they depart, and Jesus has his last encounter with the Jewish leadership in Galilee. They ask for a sign from heaven to test him, and Jesus tells them that no sign can be given to this generation. Remember, for Mark, faith comes not by seeing the miracles of Jesus and believing that they happened. Faith is a gift, and the only sign necessary is yet to come in the narrative. And they get into the boat and cross over to the other side for the last time in Mark's gospel. And this is how Mark narrates their landing on the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. He cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." They said to one another, is this because we have no bread? And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?" They said to him, 7. Then he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" A painful question to end this section before a major transition begins in the story, one we'll pick up on next week. But here, let's take stock of what we've seen today. Narratives of insider and outsider told over and over again, with language that communicates more than the simple feedings and exorcisms, but something of salvation on a grander scale. A Jewish miracle feeding in the wilderness and a Gentile one. A wealthy Greek woman scorned and demeaned by Jesus, calling him Lord and challenging him in his perspective. And he changes his mind. Over and over again, the insider-outsider binary is subverted. Boring says, just as the disciples in the narrative cannot feel superior to the outsiders, readers cannot feel superior to the dumb disciples. Neither who hear it may claim any insight or faith based on their own achievement or virtue. And in the end, the question Mark leaves us with today is similar to the one Jesus poses to the disciples at the end of the narrative. Do you not yet understand that the miracle of a simple meal together can become something much, much more, something of a foretaste of the reign of God? That everything we've known about who is an insider and who is an outsider may very well be wrong, even if it's been conveyed to us through the best of our theological tradition. That sometimes arguing with the one we call Lord can be the most faithful form of prayer and petition. That even when we have no idea where our strength or sustenance will come from, when the way runs through the wilderness, the place of scarcity and testing, that the desert places are also places of divine provision, where we are surprised to find not just a simple picnic, but where we are invited to recline as at a banquet table on the earth and taste the abundance of God's reign. Do you not yet understand?